damage. But what we're going to see over the next period is people run out of their savings, of people relying on neighbors but not being able to rely on them anymore, or of relatives or friends. And that's when the humanitarian agencies come into their own, or need to come into their own, with the basics of shelter and food. We don't actually, IRC doesn't do much food distribution, but health systems overburdened, education systems, kids without education is obviously a huge problem for the future. And this bind of the protection challenge alongside the economic challenge is often not getting the attention it deserves. So our work in Iraq, alongside other NGOs, is going to be dedicated to keeping people alive and to giving them some dignity.
Let me dig in on this notion of the internally displaced people, because I think it's a concept that's not very well understood by lay people who don't do this every day like you do. Is an internally displaced person someone who's fled Mosul because of the fighting but will likely be back in a few weeks? Is it someone who's moved in with relatives in a city where it's
really
relatively safe?
Is
it someone who's in a tent city?
It's even simpler. It's someone who flees their own home because of a crisis. So the crisis in this case is a conflict, and so an internally displaced person, the internal refers to their being displaced within their own country. One would hope they'd go back, but if they've fled because of sectarian reasons, that a Sunni militia like ISIS has moved in to Mosul and they've fled because they're Shia, they're not going to be going back anytime soon. And that's obviously the great danger, that you're in Iraq and Syria, but elsewhere, that you essentially have the division of countries into fragmented factions where people aren't able to go home and they can't start their lives again. And that has that long-term damage. I mean, there's a statistic which actually refers to refugees rather than the internally displaced people, but it's shocking. The average refugee today is out of their own home and out of their own country for 20 years.
Oh, 20 years.
So
that is an interesting
and that statistic doesn't include the Palestinians, who are the most long-term displaced refugees. So we're talking about civil wars that go on for a long time and that displace people for a long time. And I would expect the average duration of the internally displaced person to approach that scale. I mean, if you think about somewhere like in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, you've got very long-term civil wars and very long-term displacement.
Right, absolutely. So in Iraq, you've now seen a flurry of emergency diplomacy by the US and others, an attempt to get Maliki to who's a Shia, to either abdicate or create a unity government. Not a lot of willingness on his part to do so. And you see essentially the breakup potentially of the nation state of Iraq. Do you see, and in the